I am heavy
bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
Welcome to another episode of Heavy Board. I'm Andrew Wittstadt, and today we're recording this on September 16th, 2023. But as I said before, if you guys ever have an email or you want to talk to me about something that I've said, something I've written, you have disagreements or you just want more explanation or anything, send me an email. I'm happy to go over it. And I wanted to get a segment like this for subscribers where I do go into more detail about it. And, we got one of our emails here. Somebody sent me a nice lengthy email. I hope to actually have them on the podcast eventually, but we'll see. But it sounds like from this email, I'm going to read parts of it, not all of it. And obviously I'm going to keep it anonymous, listeners, but I'm going to respond to some of it for you guys that pay for this show here. A nice little bonus for you. But very long email, and I like that. That means that this the listener was thinking, was intrigued, was conflicted, man. All the things that are required when you're thinking about something deeply, and I appreciate that. So again, shout out to anyone that sends me an email here. Again, I'm very nice. I know I can come off kind of grumpy and agitated, but I'm very nice. I want to engage with stuff like this. So I'll just go through this. There's a couple, and the very nice email that's talking about how much they like the podcast, references to Heavy Board and the name, right? Everybody loves Berryman. Let's get into it. So this listener sent in, I found myself sort of engaging in an ongoing conversation with you in my mind, which is strange. Although, maybe not. I guess it's not unlike what I do as I'm reading literary criticism or essays on topics I'm interested in. And he said, wish you would have taken notes on listening and reflecting on my podcast. That's very flattering to take notes on what I say. But I appreciate you reaching out here, listener. So let's get into what some of the arguments. The listener does clarify here in this. These are in no way any serious arguments, but instead just quick and conversational thoughts. He said, read them with a sense of gratitude for you sharing your thoughts in public. Blah blah. Yeah, of course, I wouldn't take it as a negative here, listeners. But okay, so a couple episodes that this person wrote in about. I'll let you know right here. So the Hatred of Poetry episode, the Harold Bloom episode on the art of reading poetry, and the Learner episode was the Hatred of Poetry. Gary Snyder, Turtle Island, and then a little bit about Walt Whitman. So all those episodes, listeners, if you want to refresh yourself, you can go back and listen. Before I go into the first one here, I think it's important to remind everyone, I always say I don't stand by anything I say on the podcast unless I do, right? Like it's kind of this, because it is weird. Like there are some things that I say that I think are absolutely true, but then there's also we're just talking. There's we're just talking element of podcasting generally, and what can you do? So yeah, I know it's difficult for some people, especially as a listener. You're listening to me secondhand almost, even though it doesn't feel that way, right? So I get it, but I'm glad that this listener wrote in and got something out of it and actually wanted to provoke a conversation and be involved in that way, and I like that. So let's get into the Hatred of Poetry here. So what this listener wrote in is, I found myself a bit more sympathetic to learner's position, and I think this may simply come from other readings, lectures, conversations I've engaged with. This is most clear in my mind with poets that approach their poem in relation to the composition of a book-length work. And then he goes into a few examples here. He's Ezra Pound, right? When you're looking at a book-length work, the Cantos, few other writers here. I'm not familiar with all the writers that are listed here. And then there's a little bit. Okay, so let's look at this. So he says, not a book, but the book, a life's work, so to speak. One long poem. And he essentially concluded that the poems and the book are one, and that it would be impossible for the book to be written in a single lifetime, which I guess could be seen as an inevitable failure. Yes. So before I go even further, he gives a few more examples with Charles Olson, Robert Duncan, a couple other poets. So let me just address this, that the poems in the book are one, and that it would be impossible for the book to be written in a single lifetime. You know, if you want like a whole book-length work of poetry. So I guess you're maybe in the epic tradition and things like that, I think is what this listener is getting at. And then, you know, using examples of more contemporary writers that are participating in that, I think that's true. But the impossibility angle is what I struggle with really here. Impossible for the book to be written in a single lifetime. Maybe, but I just think that when we start talking in these larger scale terms, so that it would be impossible to capture something in some of these poems, I don't know. I mean, maybe most people's lifetimes they couldn't capture or couldn't complete a book-length work like Pound's Cantos or something that he considered a failure. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. But I think I'm also kind of just this idea of it being impossible to complete in a lifetime. And I was like, well, that's all we got, man. And I just think that when we go too large a scale, when we go too broad on this, like, we can't do it in a single lifetime. It's like, that could be very true, but it's also like, I feel like that is a diminishing, like we've been defeated type of attitude, where I say, I like a more positive attitude on the art, where I say, actually the goal should be to do the impossible in a single lifetime. And I know that's just as vague, but, yeah, so I think there's something to that and my real problem with Lerner's book, like The Hatred of Poetry, is that I think, and I know people don't like this, to hear this, I think Lerner I know people like his books, whatever, I've never actually read any of his books, but I know they're very popular and he's very well awarded. It doesn't matter what I say about him, but it's just like, I think Lerner has actually added nothing to any literary conversation. I think Lerner is actually, I don't mean this unless like an insult, I think he's incredibly dull and boring. I think his observations about the craft, whether that's fiction or poetry, are nothing you couldn't read in a Norton textbook anthology. I think he adds almost nothing to the conversation. I think he obscures a lot. I think he over-romanticizes a lot. And that's really my problem with a lot of The Hatred of Poetry. And my bigger problem with The Hatred of Poetry is that it doesn't actually address what he calls the hatred of poetry. I think it should have actually addressed something that book actually doesn't tell us anything, doesn't actually say much of anything about why people hate poetry, why you shouldn't hate poetry, or anything like that. It's more of just kind of a summary of things he's read and his ideas on it, which again are not very breakthrough or interesting. They are the same ideas that everybody has had about these craft forms since, time immemorial. So that's really my issue with it. But I think this listener wanted to just talk a little bit more about it. So he says, but then again, I often think that poetry at its best can help us define this kind of synthesis, can help us make new connections. So maybe it's less right/wrong, but instead more about the possibilities. And in that sense, The Hatred of Poetry seems a great provocation. And I agree with that. I think it is a provocative, even just the title is provocative, right? The Hatred of Poetry, it's a provocative title. I wish there was something behind the provocation. I think the provocation that he's doing, other than the title, is weak. Very weak. If you're hearing this, it's because you are listening to the free public feed of Heavy Board. To get complete, uncensored, uninterrupted, full access to this podcast, become a subscriber at patreon.com/heavyboard. That's right, Heavy Board is made possible by subscribers like you. For less than 1 cup of coffee per month, you will receive private access to uncensored, full-length episodes, Jerk Shop, heavy bonus content, subscribers-only AMA episodes, bonus extended interviews, and more. Come join the conversation today at patreon.com/heavyboard.